because we were so fortunate to have students who made it successful. So it was, I mean, we had good lecturers, but it's not the lecturers who make it successful. It's the students, because the purpose is that you guys participate, you guys lead the discussion, you guys set the pace. And the fact is, when you ask a lot of questions and slow it down for us, you're doing the service for the faculties who are, you know, kind of too proud to ask the questions. So it's we call to you, it's my charge to you that you make sure the lecturers give the lectures at a pace that I can follow and the rest of us can follow. So interrupt the lecturers and set the pace. Don't let them just, you know, smudge things and move on. Okay? And the first lecturer is Vadim, Oganesyan at CUNY, City University of New York, Staten Island. And Vadim was one of the very early people before most of the world knew anything about many-body localization to really set the stage and set the foundational knowledge concepts on the many-body localization. So Vadim is going to give us lectures on background of localization, moving on to sort of very modern frontier topics of many-body localization. With that, without further ado, let's first welcome Vadim.
Well, actually, we have 2 more minutes.
Oh,
I think you were too fast with that.
Oh,
so maybe an organizational question that I have, which is, it looks like there's 2 days of posters. Does everyone have their posters up on both days?
Right. Right, posters. Sorry, I was so late waking up this morning, and my kids and I were at a party last night. And we had a very late bedtime, so I'm all messed up right now. So, organizational things. There are, I believe, 12 posters. It's our tradition as of last year to give poster awards, and our amazing lecturers will be also poster judges. And I would like you to have the posters up for both days of the sessions, so that on one day, you know, everybody who are presenting the poster can be standing in front of the posters. The next day, they can also move around and see what other people have done. And posters are a great way of starting conversations. Another big purpose of the summer school is to give you guys opportunities to connect up and form the networks. I met wonderful friends in my first summer school at Boulder through poster sessions, because during the lectures, you know, we are all busy, you know, trying to follow, and it's going at a pace that's, you know, hard to follow. So it was poster session over, you know, gear that we don't have gear for the budget reasons, but at Boulder we have good food, so we'll have good fun. So we would like you to all participate in the poster sessions. Also, based on the feedback of last year, we built in more time to discuss. So if you didn't get to ask questions to the lecturer, you know, during the lecture, pin them down, ask them questions, and discuss with them. Any questions, other questions on organizational? Anybody have any questions on, you know, how to get to gorges? Another important thing that we should accomplish during the summer school. Everybody know how to get gorges? Does everybody know what gorges are?
I've seen t-shirts.
What? You see t-shirts, right? So in these gorges, those are kind of, you know, where the iceberg moved up and it dug down the land. So it kind of looks flat if you look, you know, from the sideways, but if you look down, you see these cliffs and going in valleys. Those also come with beautiful creeks. And just within walking distance from the campus, there are 2 beautiful creeks. To the best of my knowledge, there might be more. And we also even have our own private lake, also within walking distance. So after the lecture is over today at 4 p.m., we still have plenty of light, and we'll encourage you to check out our gorges in downtown. We'll give you Eric's drawing a map on how to get to the gorges. There are 2 beautiful walks. One of them is called Cascadilla Creek, and will get you down to downtown, where you can also have dinner. Any other questions? All right, so let's get started. Eric's going to explain the map.
Later, at the next break.
Next break, okay. All right, so Vadim.
All right, well, first I'd like to thank the organizers, Susan and Eric, for inviting me. It's very nice. I was particularly impressed last night when checking into the hotel that the guy at the registration knew Futurama by heart, and if you don't know, then I think all self-respecting physicists have to be able to quote freely Futurama. And I wasn't going to start with this. I mean, I can tell you what he knew. As I looked away, I was just shocked. I was like, oh, missed opportunities. I have to find this guy, and we should. But yeah, so one of the quotes that seemed apt given Una's comment about beer is that, you know, there are these heads of historical figures. One of them is FDR, and at some point, these ex-presidents have a party, and FDR proclaims, young men, they had nothing to fear but running out of beer. So I think something there. Okay, all right. Those of you who have seen the book, this is not an accident. There's a book by Phil Anderson on basic notions of condensed matter physics. I think I remember as a graduate student hearing some of my mentors getting sort of fussy about the book, that somehow this is not as good as his earlier book where things were actually explicit. So this talk, I'll mention the earlier book. So, but if you haven't seen this book is really, it's called Basic Notions of Condensed Matter Physics, where, you know, the emerging field of condensed matter physics is surveyed very descriptively. So I'm going to, my intention here is to give you, since we're now in the 21st century, is to give you essentially a personal selection of keywords, and if you're, you know, students with free time, you can just go and educate yourself further, and, you know, I'm here until the end of the school, so if you want to discuss, basically this is an opening. It's not, I'm not going to, probably not going to do math with them, but we'll see. So the outline in reverse order is, eventually I will get to discussing localization, both Anderson and main body, and at least currently our best theoretical sort of understanding is to go this way from Anderson localization to main body localization. One thing I really want to touch on is a subject which is very well mined, which is spontaneous symmetry breaking. And I think in the early days of spontaneous symmetry breaking, it was thought of as a breakdown of ergodicity or some kind of a localization. I do not know of many books that give you that perspective. The only book I know is by Nigel Goldenfeld, the book that's not used so much anymore. There's a confusing section on ergodicity breaking and spontaneous. I remember this as a graduate student, sort of leafing through it and saying, okay, this is just words I don't understand. Just move on, compute something. I think now, as especially in the recent couple of years, there's a deep connection of how dynamics and you know, breaking of symmetries in thermodynamics may be connected, and so I'd like to touch on that. There are examples basically. We don't understand things deeply, but we have examples. But keep in mind, this is going to be in reverse order. It was just easier not to fill in. So before I talk about localization, I will discuss how thermalization is thought of these days, and so I'll just, again, in the spirit of giving you keywords, let me just try to stick to my notes. Talk about hydrodynamics, quantum hydrodynamics in detail. Lots of examples, because that's my one of my favorite subjects. So I'll explain what ETH means. Well, it stands for Eigenstate Normalization Hypothesis. And I'll give you a flavor of what quenches are and how they relate to quantum normalization. But I think to start, at least I would like to give a personalized review or perspectives on conventional, what I would call conventional. Conventional conmat, to be broader. Condensed matter physics. That's it.
A good place to start, you all condensed matter.
Well, no. I think the idea, I'm not, at least my intention is not to spend more than half hour on this, so it'll be picking on things that need tweaking rather than, well, we'll see how it goes. Look, I'm happy, obviously, the happiest I will be if there are so many questions, I will forego the original plan in quotation marks. I have to say that Una sort of blackmailed me into giving a whiteboard spot. I generally prefer sticking to slides because that reduces fluctuations during the giving talk. But I like experimenting. That's okay. I don't know. I used to be a student. I still am a student, so I don't, I reserve my right to disagree. It's okay. I think it's good to experiment. So, okay, so what do I mean by, let me explain what I mean by conventional condensed matter. All right, so at the end, I have a theorist perspective, and that generally means looking at very complicated, interesting behavior and at least imagining some hierarchy, some simplifying hierarchy. So there are two general simplifying hierarchies that I'm aware of in thinking about condensed matter systems. One of them goes to the first book by Anderson. At least, again, I'm giving you references where I saw it first. Right? I don't know what the best references are. And that book was called Concepts and Solids, and it's still worth reading. But there are books with overlapping content. If you're Russian and tough, you would say Abrikosov, Gorkov, Solzhenitsyn. If you're of the same sort of upbringing in America, you would say Ferenc Boleka. That's where I learned it, but I think Anderson managed to compress it the nicest. And the idea is that this is a zero temperature perspective. Right. And the idea is that somehow you have an interacting system that has interesting correlations, and they get encoded into this structure of the ground state. And that's somehow where we start thinking about physics. So ground state has usually order volume low-lying excitations, a band of quasi-particles. I'll try to give examples when I'm finished with this part. And so the idea is that the ground state is just one state, it's zero temperature, it's physically immeasurable, or unmeasurable. Right? So we want to learn about the correlations in the ground state. What we actually compute and observe and interpret are the properties of the low temperature manifold, which is the quasi-particles, if we're lucky. In other words, if the experiment is done carefully enough. But these quasi-particles are theoretically at least, effectively non-interacting in this limit, at the low temperature limit. And so the question is that that's clearly not physically correct, right? There's some residual interactions. And so to actually understand what's going on in a real experiment, you would be doing quantum kinetics, or other dynamical calculations for which there are methods, but they're not as simple and conceptually clear. And so, one thing I remember being impressed by as a student was somehow that in Anderson's book, he looks at spin waves of an antiferromagnet and how they give you a T to the 3/2 specific heat. And then there's this parenthetical discussion, well, the spin waves are not really non-interacting, but what we need is a separation of scales. So you can think of this, in the low temperature limit, you actually have a separation of scales in the time domain where, unless you ask about complicated dynamical questions, the fact that the spin waves are interacting can be ignored. It's basically something that sets up a distribution, a quantum distribution, a Bose-Einstein distribution, say these are Goldstone modes. And ultimately, you're computing properties of weakly interacting spin waves by approximating them as non-interacting spin waves. And so I think that kind of a philosophy underlies 99% of certainly modern textbooks. Right? And that's one. So that's my summary of modern condensed matter physics. I knew it before I started working on it. But somehow, there are very interesting correlations in the ground state. Right? You can have fractional Hall effect. You can have maybe high TC superconductivity. But the idea is that you want to infer these interesting correlations and decide what phase you're in by studying, this reduction. There's actually there's a different perspective, which is, so I would call this the second half of the 20th century. There's a more recent perspective, which is post, especially since I'm Cornell, this is post Fisher-Wilson, which is to take, which is a slight modification, which is the low frequency perspective. And that's Chaikin, my go-to reference for this would be Chaikin-Levensky. But obviously these are very, very personal references. Right? And this perspective, so the shortcoming of this perspective is that it's not clear a priori how to go beyond the weakly interacting starting point. You just have to, at least the most explicit calculations that you can sort of learn from are usually perturbative. So Landau formula, obviously, I haven't mentioned it, but the most explicit one. And that seems like, well, it's kind of at best impressionistic view of condensed matter physics. So the more sort of a strongly interacting view is to say that, look, we know statistical mechanics, that does not rely on quasi-particles at all, right? We just say that there are distributions. And I'll say more about statistical mechanics in the next part of my talk. But so there's equilibrium, then there's linear response, there's non-equilibrium. And I'll put a question mark because it kind of depends on what you know how to compute. And equilibrium you can get by doing something highly non-perturbative, Monte Carlo simulations. If you have an exactly soluble model, say if you're on Sagar, you can really compute things well beyond anybody's wild dreams if this is the only thing you learn. You're not in the low temperature. The physical importance of the low temperature limit, of course, is that these elementary excitations are so dilute, they're so far apart in the systems, it's actually physically correct to assume that they're weakly interacting. Right? You got the right. So here, one does not start by making these simplifying assumptions. Instead, one just bites the bullet and solves the many-body problem, but by making an assumption of thermalization, which I will define later. And then there's a regime of linear response where at least most people think of linear response as an extension, as a rigorous extension of equilibrium. I'm less convinced, partly. Well, because the information that one needs to do linear response is not continuous. So my definition of one following from another is that the information is there. For example, if I have the ground state, I'm happy to discuss examples of that, but if I have a ground state and there are known examples, canonical examples of this, for example, in liquid helium, where I can compute quasi-particles by knowing something about them. For example, in liquid helium, if you had a ground state computed for you, then by applying, if you apply single mode approximations, you know that the quasi-particle has a momentum. You would basically go in and kick the ground state with a finite Q. You would boost the ground state, and you would get an approximate expression for the excitation of the system at that Q, elementary excitation. So whereas here, to actually go to linear response dynamics from equilibrium, you have to make additional assumptions. You have to make assumptions of stochasticity of the dynamics, which I will back in. So the interesting thing is that things are actually connected once you're not, right, in these sort of a theoretical, yes, please.
What is equilibrium defined as in terms of the eigenstates of the Hamilton?
If you last till the end of this hour, I'll yeah. Right, this is a reverse. So I think the idea is that my idea was, I didn't know what the audience was going to be. My idea was that at least there's some fraction of the audience that has been exposed to at least the words about, So, yeah, actually that's a very good comment in the sense that here the eigenstate is there. These are approximate eigenstates. Beyond that, we don't know. There's no eigenstates here, right? There are density matrices. And yeah. Well, let me keep going with this. I mean, as I said, I'm very prone to tangents. But this is just the first subsection of the first item, so let me just... So there are good aspects to having this sort of a nice hierarchical structure, at least keeping that hierarchical structure in mind. And I think it's really, we are at a stage now where we have good textbooks on how to solve difficult problems, right? And if you look at these books, all this progress has been achieved by mining this kind of a hierarchy to the point where nowadays people who have been educated, in the last 10 years, there are obvious things to do when when somebody points you to, when you realize that there is an interesting new problem, right? So especially if you're from Germany, you have a lot of graduate students, they're all doing interesting things. And it doesn't matter if there's 10 or 100 of them, you can always find something interesting for them to do because there's a nice, this is not a poker deal, right? The good thing is that this is conceptually clear. So nice organization, nice hierarchy. I used organization because I couldn't spell hierarchy last time, so sorry. It's true. Nice organization with inference. So as I already said, with inference, for example, from quasi-particles back to ground state. So the bad is is that this is very constraining. It's very restrictive, especially if you're an experimentalist doing very difficult experiments. You know, if and I had this experience from both sides, not with experimentalists, but there's somebody excited about equilibrium and going up to somebody and say, well, but this is too complicated. You want to do things in one of these two limits to get sharp answers. And if you're an experimentalist, this is just simply not feasible. If you see something interesting and somebody tells you, well, you know, that's not interesting because you're not in these limits, right? You're not in equilibrium. That seems self-defeating of the field as a whole. And I'll give you examples. Dynamics is general, and this is sort of a very sweeping, you know, in the spirit of making very sweeping statements, as a way to starting a discussion. This is generally, so dynamics is generally rich equilibrium is less. So it's a trade-off. One somehow wants to decide, do we want to really understand, it's like biology versus physics, right? You know, do we want to really understand something that's important and obviously interesting, or do we want to really understand something, right? So I feel like with going off equilibrium or going from zero temperature limit, one is trying to find a place where one can still actually do physics, right? Okay, so, all right, so what is it? I'm still in part A, compressed theorem. So part B, any alternatives to this kind of a theoretical alternatives? So, I don't know of any good alternatives. Certainly, probably not. You know, you can ask a question. All dynamical description of main body physics. Body physics. Probably not. Probably not. That's just too complicated. And we kind of know, right? I'm being somewhat dishonest here, right? Because if you actually look at the literature of what methods there exist for tackling these problems, there are methods, and I'll write a few examples again. Time-dependent, Hartree-Fock. Short time expansion. It's not that these problems are not, you know, I'll write one that I've actually worked on, truncated Wigner approximation, known in optics, and this is really just many body semiclasses. So I think the problem is that there aren't methods. The problem is that these methods are often not well controlled, not well studied. They're theoretical properties. And also, there's just no general theme. I think that's, to me, somehow the complaint is more aesthetical than that somehow one wants to have an organization scheme for thinking about complicated phenomena statistically. I think statistical mechanics, statistical physics is one of the 2 or 3 bedrocks of modern physics, at least the way I was brought up. And somehow there's this aesthetical yearning for statistics, right? And I think that this, at least, when I started asking or talking about these interesting questions that interested me, I didn't have a go-to organization. Just write it in case somebody is actually writing notes. Some statistical element is highly desirable. Okay. Okay. So let me, since I know that there are some experimentalists in the audience, let me anchor. It's always good to, at least in my experience, to oscillate back and forth rather than getting stuck in the actual work someplace in between. It's somehow, I find it refreshing to oscillate back and forth between extremes of high scale, general structures of theoretical development versus, what actual experiments are going to care about whatever you do. Right? There are experiments out there that are going to want to know answers, and so just for later discussion, let me just flash some which I think are really in bad need of understanding. Systems stand to benefit synthesis from better understanding of many-body dynamics. So there's a bunch of easy ones. So, and I'll show you some concrete examples of solid-state NMR, especially in insulators, such as calcium fluoride, which is sort of the fruit fly of solid-state NMR, where most of the techniques that eventually led to magnetic resonance spectroscopy were developed in calcium fluoride. All these sort of amusingly named pulse sequences like Wahupa, and they were all sort of developed. I'm not kidding. So this is a lost tradition. In the old days, when people were trying to abbreviate things, instead of just picking a bunch of first names, they would pick as much of the name as necessary to make something funny. So Wahupa is 3 authors. I'm not kidding. It's Wang. So John Wah and somebody else, like other people. Right. So, but the other technique in phosphorus doped silicon, there's a technique of double resonance, Endor, right? So DO starts for double, right? And the reason was that there was George Fair, who was the inventor of the technique. He was obsessed with some version of Dungeons and Dragons where there was a Witch of Endor. So he named the technique to reflect that. So I think that's kind of like, it's worth reviving. I think it adds to the,
I'll interject and say if you are ever naming something, don't name it after a person, name it after what it is, and who cares if it is a funny name.
I like funny names. I like, look, I mean, this was passed to me. Clearly, there was a string of people who, so some of this stuff dates back 60 years. Clearly, there was a string of people who enjoyed, passing it on. Okay, let me keep going. So electron spins, actually, I just mentioned. So the good news is that, so phosphorus doped silicon, a lot of these, and partly the reason I know of these systems is because they're sort of coming back. They've been known for a while, they're coming back as platforms for spintronics, quantum computing, and so there's a lot of sort of resurgence of correlated sort of spin dynamics for even phosphorus doped silicon.
So are these things sort of spiritual guidance, or are you going to give us something?
I'll give you examples of this. I think these are, so as I said, I think rather than trying to pick a few things and covering in depth my idea was to give 2 or 3 very concrete things, but then, you know, give a selection of keyword searches that you could sort of educate yourself.
But the theme here is you're talking about this, out of equilibrium stuff.
Right.
And so where does, you're going to tell us where this out of equilibrium comes up in solid state NMR.
You'll be the judge. I mean, I'll tell you what I was going to tell you about this, and you can ask me, yeah. So, qubits. Yeah, so certain solid state NMR, I'll give you examples of specific experiments that are not understood well. So, qubits of any kinds. And the thing, there's a uniting theme for these examples, all atoms, and which is why they're sort of routinely cited by theory papers as something that we're going to get insights on. So there's weak, or essentially no, with this coupling to the environment. Okay. It's easy to focus on these systems because, you know, there are physical reasons for why the timescales for opening up the system to the environment is widely separated from the timescales for the intrinsic dynamics. And so the idea is that there's a general, right? One is justified then writing just the Schrödinger equation, where these are spins only. And so as a, if I want to define a difficult problem, right, to just define it as a Hamiltonian of a closed system, go solve it by any means possible, it has a certain aesthetic appeal to it. One doesn't have to specify a decay rate into that, a decay rate into that, because certainly, if you know Schrödinger equation, this is sort of the undergraduate physics level of the definition, and that's how it has an appeal. Other systems, which I won't say anything about, which somehow I feel that are related, have a family relationship here, is they're ultra-fast probes of charge transport. There are glassy charge dynamics. So the other extreme. Generally it's very good when you have a movement and charge, because there are long-range forces and there's, somehow much larger energy scales. It's sort of difficult to convince yourself that the environment is just going to ignore that. However, one could in principle imagine that if you're interested in fast dynamics, you can still apply this terminology, or you just have to solve for the coupled electron phonon problems. And I don't, I feel like the progress here has been mostly experimentally driven. And there isn't as good of a theoretical at least idea forward. Think about it. So let me give you an example now for what let's see. So I'm going to erase this.
Yeah. You might as well flip the back one up first.
Should I grade the switchboard? Wrong. Found it. No, it's not that bad. It's not combinatorially challenging, so. No exponential barrier solving.
Would you be able to show whether your coupling's environment is something what does deep mean? Would you be able way to say what you and solving a problem that you define is one thing.
Yeah.
If I want to then say that therefore I learned something about the experiment, in reality they're solving.
I think the most honest answer one can give is that the proof is in the pudding. And have to get some results. I'll explain. Right. So if you're an experimental, so okay, look, ideally the coupling to the environment is something you can change. Right? Then you can sort of argue just even before you get in, you can get a statement from the experimentalist that here we've changed effectively the coupling to the environment by 2 orders of magnitude. The results are the same. You can go and work on the isolated systems. Trouble is, I generally think that there's no, just in the same way, there are no smoking gun experiments, strictly speaking, because until you have a theory and you know that the coupling to the environment will come in as a power law change in the result, if it comes in as a logarithm of the coupling to the environment, just having 1 or 2 orders of magnitude doesn't convince you of anything. So I feel like it's always work in progress. So if you have a theory, then you go and say, okay. So yeah, so ideal case would be that when the coupling to the environment is something you can change. So in these spin systems, the spins are sufficiently weakly interacting that if they're thermalized to begin with at room temperature, they're effectively at infinite temperature. So the spin dynamics is effectively, and I'll make that part clear. That's easy to explain. The interesting thing, of course, is that if you have a specific idea for what coupling to the environment you're worried about, say phonons. Phonons are strongly temperature dependent. So by going to lower temperatures, you can freeze out the phonons. And in fact, this is a common problem when you do charge transport. That at some point you don't know what temperature your electrons are because. So in that sense, there are clear cases where the coupling to the environment is changeable, but I think the thing that's missing, to my taste at least, is a proper theoretical modeling of the full sort of a problem, starting from the isolated problem, then putting the coupling to the environment. Is that enough to?
But right, so by saying okay, conceptually one has to start somewhere, but by saying that you're going to be interested in limit where the things be, out of all variety of non-equilibrium phenomena, you're sort of focusing on problems that cannot relax. Is that another way to think about it?
I think you have to define what relax means.
Yeah.
I relax reading the news. Some people find it really entertaining. Let me give you an example of just looking at the data and saying that's where you should look. Right? So let me look. This is ancient.
Why don't you grab a different pen? That one's not moving.
Is it okay if I throw it out?
Yes.
That's one of the things that people do.
Throwing out.
Well, I don't know, but you guys have a way of bringing them back to life. When I was a kid, we had these, obviously much less advanced markers, where we would soak them in various solvents and they would somehow get like. There's a story about gas tanks about this, but that's for later. Like, for example, let me look at something very concrete. This has been, if I had a talk, I would have this slide in the talk. This is from 1970s data, but this is essentially, as a cultural remark, this is the material that gave localization its birth. So this is basically phosphorus doped silicon. There was theory. So this is an example of a theory experiment, sort of a round trip sort of a effect. Is here there was theory in the 40s maybe or 50s by Abrahams and a couple of other sort of people that predicted what the I should write the Hamilton. The idea is that there are impurities that give rise to electron spins. Phosphorus impurities gives rise to electron spins. So phosphorus. They're coupled via hyperfine interactions to nuclei, which are sparse and randomized. So that's the Hamiltonian. Nuclei are effectively non-interacting. They interact via dipolar forces, which is sort of Hertz in this case. So this gives rise to a random field, plus there's some interaction with chemical shifts also. There's a certain fluctuating field from phonons. I don't know if you can read my subscripts. Phonons, H of T. I will write, and I will not write. So this is the kind of thing that that I find dissatisfying, where rather than computing details of the phonon interactions, we sort of can just put in an H of T. Of course, you can put in some model of acoustic phonons and compute what H of T is. Right? So the point is that no, phosphorus spin. So there's a donor, right? So what this N is the concentration of donor. The nuclear spins are coupled by hyperfine. So the idea is that so if this is pristine,
which nucleates are they?
silicon 29. So here's the physical. So I didn't think I would get into this stage, but here's one piece of. Oh, it's good. I'm happy. I'm a bit worried because this is coming from most of the faculty, but that's fine. The idea is that a single phosphorus dopant is big. It's about 20 nanometers. I didn't know this. It's about 20 nanometers in size. The concentration varies from something ridiculous like 10 to the 14 to 10 to the 18 per centimeter cubed, I mean, or more. The place where we want to be to start with is here, because here it's conducting. That's not the axis, that's just description. This is conducting, this is insulating. Okay. The axis here is, this is from a paper by Hirata, I won't get his name wrong, Shibai, but in the 70s, but this has been measured much better by people like Lion, Arjan, probably. The idea is that what they like to plot is T sub m. I've never heard of T sub m until I read this paper. So T sub m is T memory. A lot of this work actually has been funded by sort of a military, by sort of or other sort of initiatives to develop quantum memories. And what's observed is that this is ridiculously long, this could be days. And then it collapses.
That's the time.
The time, right. It's not 1 over T, it's T. So all right, memory. T memory.
Is T memory T2 or T1?
It's everything is long. I think that they call it T memory.
Is the definition T2 or T1?
They take the shorter one, T2. Yeah, T2. But they can make it very long. I mean, the surprising thing.
I don't care how long it is, I just wanted to know what it is. It's T2.
No, but the point is that the way they measure it, they have a different protocol. So they take the protocol that there's different pulse sequences. So they take the longest. I mean, it's kind of like post-selection. It's invariably T2 because T1 is somehow too long. In fact, it's actually interesting. The way they do these experiments, because all of these lifetimes are so long, it's impossible to do the experiments and repeat them and get statistics. So what they do is they do one run, then they flash light at their sample, because by flashing light they can change the effective carrier concentration. The whole thing just relaxes. So they basically light reset their samples. So they experiment with yeah. Anyway, the point is that this is where 99% of the experimental work has been done, because that's the emphasis is to create very long-lived states. And here, the theory is all in here. It's phonons, right? Especially, unless you push the really long T memory, the nuclei are treated as static. In fact, I didn't finish this picture. There is about 5% concentration of silicon 29, which has nuclear spins. And what happens is that, so if you're a theorist and you've been paying attention recently, there's this central spin problem that's very popular. People have been studying. This is one of the first motivations for the central spin problem. You have a spin and a half living here, and it sees a controlled, well, some typical number of nuclear spins that are treated as mutually non-interacting, but only interacting now in the carbon chart with an electron spin. Right, so there's electron spin here, there's silicon 29 here. So that's roughly the Hamiltonian. And I mean, I kid you not, I spent years trying to understand why did nobody, since this work motivated Anderson to come up with Anderson localization, because what happened, right, I didn't finish that story, I'm sorry. There were theoretical estimates for what the spin relaxation should be. Experiments came out and said, no, there's just no spin relaxation, period. And Anderson said, you know, it must be something quantum coherent, and, you know, so the theory came out. The experimentalist, in this case, George Fair, he ignored the theory because he said, roughly, we never see any sign of exchange. It's just non-interacting spins. I don't have to think about hopping at all. Right? And so the subject died there, but the point is that this kind of behavior was, you know, recorded, certainly in the 70s, and it's pretty clear, to answer Una's question, is that here, as you change the concentration of electron spins, nothing happens to the lifetime. Right? So if you wanted to make a case that things are non-interacting, at least unless you start actually going in and dynamically accessing two spins, sort of a coherence, you know, basically trying to create initial states that are somehow non-thermal, and actually trying to observe correlated dynamics, this is the best you can ask for. And that's been out there forever. The thing that's, I think, as an, you know, negligence, as an active negligence, is that they all knew about, this is published data, they all knew that once you crank things up, exchange takes on and just the system becomes interacting and they stop being able to measure G2, and everything just relaxes, the line fills in, I mean, I think. And this happens well before the system delocalizes. Right? So there is clear evidence of exchange happening and things here are interacting. And so the hope is that if you're in this regime where you haven't lost your control of the experiment, so you can see that the relaxation is somehow building dependent. Right? I mean, the relaxation is, yeah.
So what's the precise definition of the lifetime?
Right. So one lifetime is that. So if you have a Hamiltonian like that, okay. Oops, I shouldn't be using this. So if you have, again, let's start with something simple. Right. So this is a bunch of spins that are actually infinitely long-lived, but they have different frequencies. So the experiment you will do is that you have a large field, so you have a large mean field, but some side-to-side fluctuations in the field, so that you start off with an equilibrium density matrix, which is identity minus some B over E average, let's say, KBT IZ. So strictly speaking, if I'm doing thermal torsion, I shouldn't start approximating this early on, especially when I don't have to. Right. Let's say that this is the equilibrium density matrix. So the idea then is that, and typically, certainly in NMR, since that's what I was going to talk to, I looked up the numbers, is that this is about 10 to the negative 6. It's just tiny. 1 out of a million spins is magnetized. And the idea is that there's a dynamical experiment where you would take, I will write it as a R sub pi over 2, right? You would take basically a state which is magnetized along Z. You would apply, since you can measure the mean Larmor frequency, you can apply a pulse that will just flip the spins. And depending on how long you keep the pulse on, you can flip them into the X, you know, so that the net magnetization goes from being IZ to IN. And then you just watch it. Right? And so the point is that there is one definition of lifetime which just basically tracks the temporal decay of Ix, and if all of these fields were uniform, it wouldn't decay. You would just see everybody oscillating at the same time. So you would see a really fast oscillation. So this would be, like inverse B in the time domain. And usually these fast oscillations are even subsumed in the definition. But instead what happens is that, so one picture that you will get is that, this envelope, well, okay, maybe I'll example it. So if this envelope decays, this is one. Right? So this is a lifetime, apparently. So if this is the source of this, right, it's easier to talk about in spectral terms, right? So if you Fourier transform that, you get a spectral function of the spin system, and it's not a delta function. So lifetime broadening is, roughly speaking, it's full width, the half maximum of the spectral length. If you know, right, just think of dimensional analysis. This has units of 1 over time. This has units of frequency. You basically, if you think of it in a frequency domain, you want to get something that will, a delta function will give you no decay. You want to get some kind of decay. The story, of course, is more complicated because these kinds of effects are unavoidable and they don't tell you about the lifetime of an individual spin state. So these kinds of effects can be removed by doing additional corrections onto the dynamics, so-called Hahn echoes, sort of the simplest echo. So here, they've done the best they could to make this spin system coherent, and you can see this is a long answer to this question that you can make arguments that the system is non-interacting here, but coupled to the environment. Here the system is interacting. Still, I'm sure it's still coupled to the environment, but as long as this is a logarithmic axis, in other words, if the relaxation rates that you're studying here are 3 orders of magnitude faster than what you had before, that's good enough to motivate.
So I'm being confused because when I introduced the localization, I always think about conducting states and wave functions.
This is the extreme limit where there is no things that delocalize because they're disconnected, if you like.
But this is along the spin.
It's for this, right. So when we talk about localization at the level of Anderson, when Anderson defined localization, he had words about spins in the introduction of the paper, but ultimately this was defined as one particle moving in a random single particle sort of Hamiltonian. If you like, it's spin waves, right? So if you thought of spins, you would ask